The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, but the shadows around my house were already thick, crawling over the edges of the lawn like dark fingers. A chilling wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. From inside, I could see headlights slicing through the darkness, cutting jagged lines across the driveway. They weren't cops I recognized. They never were. But they came with badges, uniforms, the kind that demanded obedience. I froze as the front door creaked under the weight of someone trying to force it open. My pulse spiked. This wasn't a random break-in. These were officials, or at least that's what they wanted me to think. The air grew thicker, heavier, each second dragging like it carried a secret I wasn't supposed to know yet. My mind raced. Who had called them? What rules had I broken that I didn't even know existed? The figure at the door pushed harder, their shadow stretching long across the floorboards. And then it hit me, the audacity, the sheer sense of entitlement radiating from them. They had assumed authority over my home, over me. Not just authority, but a belief that I was powerless, invisible, beneath their scrutiny. And I realized something darker. This wasn't just about me. This was about a pattern, a system that thrived on prejudice, on assumptions, on fear of someone who didn't fit. I walked forward calmly, each step echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. The hum outside grew louder, almost alive, vibrating through the walls. And just as their hand touched the doorframe to push me aside, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing that would change everything. Their faces froze, their confidence faltered, as if the world had just shifted under their feet. They had no idea what they were dealing with. They had no idea who I really was. Hit subscribe, watch till the end. The house sat on the edge of the neighborhood like a fortress, a mix of modern lines and weathered stone that spoke of decades of history. From the outside, it seemed calm, ordinary, almost sleepy, with the soft hum of streetlights illuminating the edges of the lawn. But inside, the air always carried a subtle alertness, a quiet awareness that every shadow, every distant sound, could be something more than it seemed. Years of service in the FBI had taught me that danger often wore a casual face, and complacency was the luxury of those who didn't know what real threats looked like. The neighborhood itself was deceptive. Manicured lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and cheerful mailbox flags gave an appearance of serenity, but beneath the surface, there was a subtle tension. A silent war of entitlement, where appearances mattered more than truth, and authority was wielded by those who assumed they deserved it. The Homeowners Association, a seemingly benign organization, had long been the enforcer of this illusion, policing lawns, fences, and occasionally, the people who didn't fit. And it was that invisible tension that had started building the moment we moved in. At first, the signs were small, almost laughable. A letter about an overgrown bush, a complaint about noise we hadn't made, a demand that felt absurdly personal. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern became unmistakable. Every interaction carried an undertone, a subtle reminder that we were outsiders, that our presence was an inconvenience to the carefully curated world they were protecting. I had encountered discrimination in my professional life many times, but this was different. This was personal. This was local, intimate, and relentless. I had long ago learned to read the room, to sense the weight of judgment even when it wasn't spoken. And in this neighborhood, judgment was always there, lurking behind smiles and polished greetings. They measured everything: the color of skin, the way one spoke, the invisible markers of heritage or difference. It was exhausting, a constant dance of caution, of careful calculation, to move through the world without giving them an excuse to act. But nothing could have prepared me for the day the HOA decided to escalate their quiet, insidious surveillance into something more tangible, something designed to humiliate, to exert power over someone they assumed powerless. That morning, I had been tending to the garden, hands deep in soil, when I noticed the first sign. A figure at the end of the driveway, standing just out of reach of the streetlights, observing. The posture was too deliberate to be casual, too still to be innocent. And then another appeared, emerging from the shadow of the neighbor's house, a clipboard in hand as if cataloging our existence. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, The same sensation that had warned me in countless operations before. Something was coming. Something orchestrated, calculated. I moved through the house with quiet precision, checking locks, scanning cameras, assessing exits. Years of training kicked in, each movement deliberate, each decision measured. The stakes were different now. This wasn't a federal case, it was personal, but the methodology was the same. Observe, anticipate, control. And yet, beneath the calm logic, there was a simmering awareness of injustice, a recognition that this intrusion was born of bias, of assumptions made about who I was and what I was capable of. The HOA had no idea that the person they were targeting wasn't just any resident. Their sense of entitlement, their confidence in their perceived authority, blinded them to the truth. They assumed fear, submission, compliance, but they were about to discover that reality doesn't bend to prejudice. I had trained for threats far more dangerous, faced situations far more lethal, but the principle was identical. Underestimating someone based on assumptions was a mistake that could cost dearly. Outside, the day stretched on in deceptive calm. Birds chirped, neighbors walked dogs, mail trucks rumbled down the asphalt, and yet, the tension coiled tighter with every passing hour. Something was being prepared, orchestrated beyond the visible scope of ordinary life. It wasn't just a routine check or a complaint. It was an assertion of control, a test of boundaries, a microcosm of systemic bias manifesting in the quiet, everyday lives of those who dared exist outside the expected mold. I moved from room to room, checking security cameras, noting patterns, observing movements. Every flicker of shadow, every car on the street, every knock on a distant door was a potential threat vector. The HOA didn't understand the stakes, but that didn't matter. Awareness, preparation, and composure were enough to tip the scales. I wasn't merely defending property. I was asserting presence, reclaiming agency in a space that had been treated as if I didn't belong. By evening, the shadows deepened, stretching across the yard, curling around the edges of the house like the invisible tendrils of expectation and judgment. And in that darkness, a quiet certainty settled over me. They were coming. Not because of the law, not because of right or wrong, but because they assumed power, assumed compliance, assumed they could dictate reality. They were wrong. And as the night prepared to unfold, the lines between authority and audacity, entitlement and consequence, prejudice and truth, would blur. Every assumption they had made about who I was, every bias they had harbored, every calculation they had relied upon would collide with the truth of my identity. The stage was set, the tension palpable, and the story was about to move from quiet injustice to confrontation. The evening grew heavier, shadows stretching across the yard like warnings etched into the air. Headlights appeared again, slower this time, deliberate, crawling across the driveway with the precision of predators. They moved as if rehearsed, their badges catching the dim glow, a silent assertion of authority that didn't belong to them. I watched from the window, measuring their steps, their confidence, their sense of entitlement. Every inch of intrusion was a challenge, a test of whether I would falter, whether their assumptions about fear and submission would hold true. From the periphery, I noticed movement in neighboring yards, figures lurking, observing, not official but complicit. The subtle tension in the air thickened, carrying the unspoken understanding that this wasn't simply a confrontation over rules. It was about asserting dominance, marking territory, an invisible hand of systemic bias reaching into the quiet corners of life. Their sense of control was intoxicating to them, a belief that they could dictate reality, manipulate the boundaries of who belonged and who did not. Inside, I moved with precision, adjusting cameras, noting exits, sensing their hesitation even as they approached. The injustice was palpable, the audacity of entitlement never so brazen. And then it hit, their first attempt to breach the threshold. The door rattled under pressure, hands pushing, demanding, assuming. Yet I was ready. Years of training, countless confrontations with danger, had prepared me for this moment in ways they could never imagine. Their eyes widened, confidence faltered, and for the first time, the power dynamic shifted. They had no idea that the person standing calmly behind the door was not just a resident, not just a target. They were about to collide with someone trained to see through deception, someone whose very identity would turn their assumptions inside out. The night had fully descended, shadows pressing against the walls, thick and suffocating, carrying the weight of every unspoken assumption, every silent judgment the HOA had ever leveled. Their footsteps were deliberate now, crunching on the gravel, a rhythm of intrusion and entitlement. They believed the law, their letters, their badges, everything they wielded, was enough to bend reality to their will. But they had miscalculated. As they reached the front door again, pushing with a force that betrayed their frustration, I moved calmly to the threshold. The air seemed to crackle, tension thick enough to taste, each second stretching into eternity. They thought fear would greet them. Instead, they found precision, composure, authority born of experience far beyond their imagination. And then, with a deliberate motion, I revealed the truth. The badge in my hand wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't a threat, it was a declaration of reality. Their faces went pale, confidence crumbling like dry stone under pressure. Every assumption they had made, every bias that had fueled their actions, collided violently with the truth. They hadn't come to enforce rules. They had come to assert dominance over someone they assumed weaker. And in an instant, the imbalance flipped. The air vibrated with the sound of disbelief, entitlement shattering, a hum of chaos threading through the night. They froze, hands half raised, unsure whether to retreat or persist, their authority evaporating under the weight of reality. Every calculated move, every assumption about power and control was now meaningless. They were exposed, vulnerable, small before the very person they had tried to intimidate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The presence alone, the quiet assertion of identity, the truth laid bare, was enough to dismantle their overreach. The night carried a new rhythm now, a rhythm of reckoning, of consequences, of power finally aligned with justice. They had underestimated me. They had assumed fear. And in their mistake, the night became a testament to what happens when entitlement collides with truth, when bias meets experience, and when assumptions about identity are proven catastrophically wrong. The night finally settled, but the air remained thick with echoes of what had just occurred. The HOA enforcers, once confident in their assumed authority, were now scattered in disbelief, their entitlement evaporated under the weight of truth. The stillness that followed was not peace, but a tense acknowledgement of reality. Power is not granted by badges, letters, or assumptions, it is earned, proven, and respected. Inside, the house returned to quiet, the hum of the evening now replaced by reflection. Every shadow, every creak of the floor, felt different, charged with the memory of confrontation, of injustice challenged and dismantled. The entitlement that had permeated the neighborhood, the subtle prejudices that had whispered through every complaint, every intrusion, had been confronted head-on, stripped of pretense by the revelation of truth. Yet the story did not end with mere vindication. The incident was a microcosm of something larger, a reflection of a world where assumptions are made about identity, where bias shapes behavior, and where those in positions of supposed authority often fail to see beyond their own narrow lens. The confrontation had exposed the fragility of entitlement, but also the persistence of systemic bias that thrives quietly until challenged. As the hours passed, the neighborhood seemed smaller, its power structures diminished, yet the lessons loomed larger than any single night. Justice, when aligned with awareness and preparation, can transform fear into clarity, submission into accountability. And yet, it also demands vigilance, an understanding that the world is filled with those who assume dominance without merit, and that standing firm against injustice is both a responsibility and a test of character. The night closed with a lingering question, one that refuses to fade with the darkness. How many assumptions are made about people based on what is visible, superficial, or convenient? And how many of those assumptions will go unchallenged unless someone dares to reveal the truth? Hit subscribe, watch till the end.